Thank you, gentlemen, for your input this weekend. Pastor Toby wasn't able to be here because of the aforementioned painting, so you'll just have to pull off your best Toby impersonation if there's a question for Toby. Yeah. I'm going to raise her up here or something. So I guess one thing that comes to mind is, what do you make of certain Christian authors, particularly in kind of the devotional or pietistic vein, thinking of guys like Oswald Chambers, who would say things like, that would suggest that whenever somebody asks you for money, you must give them whatever you have, no questions asked, your bottom dollar, that sort of thing. What, balancing that with Christ's command, give to those who are in need. What do you make of those sort of authors or those sort of demands when they make those statements?
They probably need to listen to Doug's last talk. I love Oswald Chambers. He was converted under Spurgeon's ministry, and he got involved in sort of the New Spirit movement. It wasn't quite charismatic, but it was oftentimes rather sentimental.
The Keswick conventions.
And the Keswick stuff. And so, one of the things that I say about Oswald Chambers is, I love some of his stuff. But you've got to realize that if you don't have a grounding in the sovereignty of God, the covenants of God, his purposes in binding the people, you're always going to have holes.
And I would add, when Christians take some of the hard sayings or the angular sayings of Jesus, and they take them sort of straight up the middle, no qualifications, they frequently find themselves running into things. But in the meantime, I think we can respect that kind of thing. It's, okay, this person is serious about their discipleship, let it run, and they're going to bump into reality on the one hand, and they're going to bump into other Bible verses on the other. Yeah. So you're giving to this guy on the street, but then you're called as a pastor because of your godliness, and this guy off the street comes in, he's not willing to work. Well, now I've got two conflicting commands. If he's not willing to work, he shouldn't eat. So what I have to do is, systematic theology is nothing other than remembering what you learned in the last verse while you're reading this verse.
Right. The other thing to remember about Oswald Chambers is that he was dramatically reshaped by his experience in World War I in Egypt, and then he died. And Kathleen, his wife, is largely responsible for over-sentimentalizing everything from there.
So a lot of those guys will point to verses, the rich young ruler, where Jesus tells him, "Sell everything you have and give it to the poor," and they absolutize those passages. What would you say to someone who's absolutizing that passage?
A great book on this topic that I wanted to look for a chance to plug already is a wonderful book for contextualizing those sorts of things, and it's a book called "The Maker versus the Takers." Yeah. The Maker versus the Takers by Jerry Bowyer, Bowyer. And he points out that all of the Lord's hard sayings on wealth were uttered in Judea, not in Galilee. So and you have to realize that there's Galilee, Samaria, Judea. Judea was where the temple complex was, and the economy was all bound up with the government and with the temple sacrificial system and so on.
It was incredibly corrupt.
Absolutely corrupt. Right. So people don't realize that the temple, for example, was also a bank. Yeah. So, it was a lending institution. And Jesus and Rabbi Hillel had come up with a workaround on, how your debts were supposed to be released every 7 years. Well, if you sold the debt, if the creditor sold the debt, they had an arrangement where you could sell it, for example, to the temple, and then the 7-year release was null and void. All right. So they developed workarounds to keep people trapped in bondage. And so the rich young ruler, the fact that ruler there is significant. He's a senator. He's part of the government apparatus. He's part of this corrupt system. So when Jesus cleanses the temple, flips over the tables and he says, "My house should be called a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves," right? For my house should be called a house of prayer for all nations. The Gentiles should be coming in here. You've made it a den of thieves. He's attacking the corruption straight up the middle. So this was corrupt cronyism with regard to wealth in Judea. In Galilee, where it was more blue-collar, entrepreneurial shopkeepers, Jesus says nothing against wealth per se there. All of his... so this book, The Maker versus the Takers, goes through these things in great detail. Is really worth your time. It's a great book.
It's just out. Just been out.
A month or so.
A month or so. It's really, really good. The other thing that I would do is I would try and teach the difference between indicatives and imperatives.
Right. That's something that can be applied throughout
on everything.
Everywhere you go in the Bible. Yeah. Here's one for Pastor Doug. Dave Ramsey quote: "Live today like no one else, so that you can give tomorrow like no one else." How do we keep from an ascetic perspective and enjoy the material things in our society without guilt?
Okay, so I would want to, as a pastor, I'm very grateful for Dave Ramsey's impact. I think a lot of people need a little Dave Ramsey in their lives, and you need an anti-debt Nazi.
Ask Dave Ramsey into your bank account.
Yes. So that said, I do. So I think its effect has been beneficial and good in lots of ways. But the one thing I would encourage you not to do is become pinched and hard over time when you get used to this disciplined, rigorous lifestyle where you're afraid to give anything away or whatever. That quote I like very much. I think the quote is right on the money. But oftentimes rank and file Christians who have been indulging themselves, and then it's sort of like CrossFit for your finances, or becoming a vegan for your finances, where you Winston Churchill defined a fanatic as someone who can't change his mind and won't change the subject. Vegan,
people see you and cross the street.
They see you across. So basically, listen to what Dave Ramsey says there and realize that he probably has more discipline on the generosity side than you might if you're the new convert zealously watching your outlays. All right, so be careful that you don't become too much of a Dave Ramseyite, but a little bit is going to be really good for you.
Especially if you're in debt.
Yeah.
I know Dave. I do devotions at his company once a quarter, and he's got this shtick, and it's hard-edged, it's serrated. I don't know many other people that are quite like that, but
yeah, you would never hang out with those sort of people, right?
No. Yeah. But the thing is he's getting people out of crisis. He's shaking them back to reality, and Dave always emphasizes the joy of financial freedom, that prosperity is a joy to be enjoyed, and that the greatest part of prosperity is the opportunity to be generous. And I have never met anyone more generous than Dave.
Here's one for you, Dr. Grant. Can you give examples of how Chalmers incentivized the family and encouraged a work ethic? And then why was there the pushback from community heads?
Yeah, one of the things that they did in their ministry was they made goods and services available to people, but they were made available first to those who are working hard to keep their families intact. They would incentivize the work of the husband and the father. They just made sure that instead of doing what our welfare system does, which is to incentivize breaking up the family. They were constantly giving a priority to those intact families. So he had a kind of a tiered system. The harder you worked and the more committed you were over time, the more privileges that you would have, more access to resources you would have. And the hope is that you would stair-step your way right into full independence and productivity.
That's great. I think you talk about that, and I'll plug your book again. I think you talk about that in the book, about how we've incentivized in our structure. We've incentivized the immoral things like premarital pregnancy and single mother homes, and penalized the
intact
morals.
families.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You've both invested a lot of effort and leadership in renewing classical Christian education, and education. I think as Pastor Doug mentioned, that education is a form of wealth, and thus this effort of renewal of classical education is a form of charity. It's giving to those who are educationally impoverished a generation or so ago, and now we're seeing the fruits of that. But what other areas should the church be looking at to show true Christian charity, or bring some of that same renewed energy? What other areas of culture and society do we need to be aiming at now? I feel like the classical Christian education movement is got a lot of steam now, but what are areas that we need to put our attention to now?
In the next 3 years, the Biden administration will pump $1.3 trillion into Planned Parenthood. How much are we investing in crisis pregnancy centers? I mean, that's a pretty simple, straightforward kind of thing. Counseling centers. I'm so grateful to the Lord that churches like Christ Church have counseling centers. We need to be on the front lines, especially at a time when there's so much garbage pop psychology out there.
Self-care.
So, all of that. So, those are two really simple, straightforward things that churches can be doing immediately to have enormous impact in the cultural environment we find ourselves in.
Another field that's white onto harvest, I would say, would be prison ministry and people on their way to prison or people just out of prison. And you can't be ministering to people in that position without dealing with drugs, detox, alcohol, that sort of thing. So we have a relationship, Christ Church has a relationship with a Christian Center in Coeur d'Alene, just up the road from us, where we frequently set someone up to go through their discipleship program. Because basically, if someone's right out of prison and looking for a job, we want to be able to find them a job. We want to be able to get them accountability so that they don't get sucked back in to the old crowd where they're going to be selling drugs again in 10 minutes. And, basically, there are a lot of people who need a lot of help, and that's a place where the Christian gospel, the Christian witness, can make a huge difference. And I agree with George on the first two.
The other thing that corresponds to that is halfway houses. We have in our community a halfway house that we've helped staff and man, and we do Bible studies there. It's an opportunity for those who are coming out of incarceration to have some time before they're just flung out into the community, where they have structure, they have order. It's kind of a version of Spurgeon's almshouses, and we get these guys ready to go back into the real world because it takes baby steps. They're not ready when they just come right out of prison. So halfway houses, buy a distressed house, have the church fix it up. Go to work in finding ways to connect with existing prison ministries, and there's a thriving ministry right there.
And remember that it's messy ministry.
It's not going to be sunshine. It is very messy. Yeah. And as Doug pointed out in his talk, that There are deserving and undeserving people who will pass through, and there'll be people that are playing the game and work in the system. That's a part of it. And sometimes the most glorious conversions are those who come in scamming from the start.
Right. And they finally get their hearts broken by the
Exactly.
Lord eventually. Yeah. I have a
One of
friend
my
that-
prayer requests is to be able to eventually lead to the Lord that elusive Nigerian prince.
I've got his email address. We've been corresponding.
And then he can start tithing off of his fortune that he
millions.
has.
Yeah.
Yeah, apparently. Exactly. I have a friend that does a lot of inner city ministry and ministry with those messy in those messy situations, and he calls them EGR people, extra grace required. You're just gonna have to, Lord, give me patience here, give me mercy. So sort of springboarding off of that, someone asked, what charity to the poor does Christ Church engage in? And I'd let you speak to what other charities and mercy ministries your church is involved in. And Doug, if you want to touch on some of the things that we're involved in here.
So we have a thing called, one of the tasks that our deacons have assigned to them. Our deacons, we've got a hardworking group of deacons. One of their focuses is outreach. So we have, they minister to people who are hurting inside the congregation. They also take care of logistical operations, the facilities and our security teams and bookkeeping, collecting the offering. They do that sort of thing. But then they also have an outreach, I don't hesitate to call it a program, but we call it benevolence. So when someone is down on their luck or they need, the power is going to be turned off, they need help from the community, they can go online and fill out an application, and we set up an appointment. They come down to the church office. A couple of deacons meet with them and review the situation, and frequently give help. And but we give help in a qualified way. We don't want to just throw money at situations. We want to help them with budgeting and help them with any particular challenges they have. But I would say there's a steady stream of people from the community that come in to utilize the benevolence program. And that's also a good program that we have that enables us to coordinate with other evangelical churches in the area that are doing similar things. Sometimes we team up with them, and then it's through the benevolence arm of the church that we will occasionally send someone to rehab, and get that paid for and covered.
We have something really similar with our deacons, and every one of the things that you've just mentioned are things that we do as well. We also have the Onesimus House, the halfway house that we work with. We are heavily involved in a local ministry called Graceworks, which it's a food bank, and we do fundraisers for them. And at Christmas time, we supply counselors so that when families come in, they can go grocery shopping and Christmas shopping in the warehouse, but they are presented with the gospel, and we have an opportunity for follow-up, and we try and match them with people that will walk with them. It's a really wonderful kind of program. We are heavily invested in the Crisis Pregnancy Centers of Middle Tennessee, and we have counselors and so forth that are there. We have the Chalmers Fund, which is a means by which we help families that can't afford to send their children to a classical Christian school. We help them with the tuition or books so that they can afford it. So, little practical things.
Nancy and I started the Crisis Pregnancy Center here in Moscow years ago. It's now independent and standalone thing, and we're supportive of that. Also, we have a Christian education fund that's a subset of our deacons fund, because we don't want any kid in the congregation to fail to receive a Christian education because of money.
Amen.
So if they're a covenant child, we want to be supportive of them that way.
And that's kind of the mindset of the Chalmers Fund.
That's great. I've noticed over the years that many of the folks who are most concerned and have the most energy to get involved with charity ministry and mercy ministry, with helping the poor, they tend to not have an immune system against Marxism and critical race theory, and they get sucked into viewing the world through those victim categories. So how does someone who's very interested in getting involved in mercy ministry, how do they develop the immune system against those secular categories?
Tola lege.
Yeah. Be steeped in the word, but I wouldn't if we were to, let's say we created a position where someone's going to be a full-time staff member overseeing our mercy ministries. Let's say we're at that level. I'd want them to be in the word and what's their character, what's their family like, and so forth. But I would also want to know, how much have you read in economics? Have you read Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson? Have you read Thomas Sowell's Vision of the Anointed? Have you read these books? I think
Herbert Schlossberg,
Idols for Destruction. I think a lot of the people think that they can deal with economic issues not having studied economics. You simply can't do that. You have to know how. You have to be able to explain why. If it costs $1 to make a loaf of bread, you can't require someone to sell a loaf for 50 cents and still have bread, right? You've got to know why that is the case. And so I would want anybody who's involved in mercy ministry and handling money to be fully checked out on standard, basic, common sense economics.
They can do simple mathematical equations like 2 + 2 = 4, that sort of thing. Yeah.
You're going to get your categories from somewhere.
Yeah.
So if you're not getting your categories from substantive reading and research and thinking, you're going to get it from CNN.
Yeah. Yep.
Lord help us.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the Toxic Charity by Lupton, he points out that charity has become just a word that's unhelpful in many ways, and he uses the word parity, and giving people their food bank that he helped to start got it to the place where all the people who were receiving from it were invested in running it, and they reaped any profits from it, and so you're giving them an opportunity to learn those skills as well, not just the raw handouts. Or the other example is the Tom's shoes. I don't know if you remember those back in the day, that you buy a pair of shoes and we'll send a pair to the orphans over in Africa. And what happens is they undercut the local shoemaker is all that ends up happening. And the local shoemaker can't make a living to feed his family. And so I think it's those sorts of things that need to be drilled down.
Another book is When Helping Hurts.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think in the booklets we gave out, there's a list of suggested reading that has some of those books there, if you wanted to look those up. For Dr. Grant, the historical stories you told were great. Do you have any contemporary ones? Is anybody doing this still? Who's serving the poor well and effectively now and here in our Marxophilic culture? What a word. What examples can we look to among our peers? How about in other places? Who can we support as they serve the poor overseas?
Yeah, there are some really, really remarkable works that are taking place around the world. Unfortunately, you can't just make a blanket assertion. For instance, I love Samaritan's Purse in places, but it so much depends upon who's running the local program. So, for instance, I know that there is incredible work done by Samaritan's Purse in the refugee camps all around Syria, in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Iraq. But in Peru, I have found that Samaritan's Purse is basically Marxist. So one of the things that you have to do is I really, really strongly believe in relational giving, rather than institutional giving. Identify the missionaries or the workers or the volunteers that are doing really good work and funnel your giving through them. That takes a little bit of digging, and it takes a little bit of experimenting, but it's most assuredly worth it. As far as people who are doing really good work, again, I've mentioned crisis pregnancy centers over and over again. That is frontline caring. It's not just about the pro-life issue. It's not just abortion oriented. These crisis pregnancy centers oftentimes walk with families for the long haul. They have an opportunity to disciple and shape, and lives are really changed. Karen and I have started multiple crisis pregnancy centers, and I look back and I think those are among the most fruitful things we've ever done. So strongly recommend that. And then there are oftentimes, there are national organizations like Second Harvest Food Bank. Again, locally, they may be a little sketchy, but there are places where Second Harvests are run really, really well with really, really good foundational principles driving the kind of ministry they do. So you just have to hunt, you have to look, you have to sort. There are no brand names out there.
What is the proper role, if any, for the government in addressing poverty? And should the state be involved in things like foster care? Is there an alternative model we should look to?
I think that the central proper role of the government is to stay the heck out of the way, because there are numerous things that I would love to see us be able to do. But one of the reasons why you'd have to go around the globe looking for some really fruitful, creative outreaches is they're not strangled by government regulation. They can just go into a place and do it, right? But if you wanted to start, let's say, a hospital here in the States, you're going to be regulated into disobedience. Right. So if you wanted to do something creatively where this clinic that is operating on a different program where you're not trapped in the insurance system, where the treatment that you got is one thing if it's you and another thing if it's the insurance company, why does it cost, if you said, hey, I can pay cash for this and it costs a fifth of what it would cost if they build the insurance company, that's corruption. Right? That's all it is. And if you try to start a medical practice or an orphanage or a hospital or anything like that here in the States, you're going to find yourself with inspectors who say you can't do that. We won't allow you to do that. So you've got to be prepared to fight the man and do the work of charity. If you wanted to go into a failed state somewhere in the world where all you have to worry about is warlords.
That's all.
That's all. They can be.
There are always those. They're just disguised a lot better in America.
Right. So basically, the problem is cleaner and more straightforward there. But I believe that we should be preparing for the time when a lot of the current infrastructure of disobedience is crumbling. I think it's crumbling as we speak. Right. This is called Stein's law in regard to economics, and that is anything that cannot continue on indefinitely won't. Right. So it's going to come to an end. Margaret Thatcher said the problem with socialism is sooner or later you run out of other people's money, and then there you are. And I think Christians need to be preparing for the day when all we will have is the problem of hurting people, and not the problem of hurting people and then fighting off the regulators. Yeah,
exactly. Individually, it is often easier to give money rather than to give your time. Can you talk about more to our responsibility of giving time generously, specifically the proper balance with a busy schedule of vocation and family duties?
I love the stories that Doug told about his father and the way that Jim would show his sons what it was like to minister, sometimes in awkward and difficult cases. What I would say to every dad, your children need to see you read, your children need to see you pray, your children need to see you give, your children need to see you sacrifice, your children need to see you in the lives of others.
That's good, man. Amen.
Someone asks, and I'd piggyback on this question with a bit of a follow-up. What's the difference between social justice and biblical justice? And I'd be interested for you guys to flesh out some of the gleaning laws of the Pentateuch in particular, and how do we translate those into your software development business, or your how do you take those gleaning laws or those care for the poor laws and apply them in our day and age?
I'll speak to social justice, and George can talk about gleaning, since you wrote a book about it. Right. Social justice is simply communism, and that phrase ought to hit us the way bone cancer does. Social justice is appalling. Social justice is a false doctrine, false gospel, false savior. When someone wants to be a social justice warrior, what they're saying is that what they're confounding are two things that 30 seconds of reflection should show you cannot be confounded. And that is, there's a difference between charity, a man with love in his heart towards someone extending a helping hand, right? That's biblical love, biblical charity, biblical helping out. And another situation where men with guns go to a one man's house and make him give money to this program and threaten him with prison if he doesn't, right? And then calling that charity, or that's compassion. It's not compassion to tax some hardworking welder in Iowa, halfway out of business, and threaten him with prison time if he doesn't give a certain portion of his taxes to these people, mediated through these bureaucrats who are going to make a hash of it. That's called philanthropy or compassion, and it's nothing. It doesn't even remotely resemble it, and that's what the social justice warriors want more of. And it's contradictory. I saw a great meme that had a bunch of riot police and a bunch of yippies, we used to call them, a bunch of people rioting, and the clash, and these people are demanding more government, and then an arrow points to the riot police, says more government. We're demanding more government, here we have more government. That's social justice. I think we should be have an allergic reaction when anybody says that or woke or anything like that. We just go, Gleaning.
Okay, so gleaning. Goodwill and secondhand shops are a form of gleaning. There are all kinds of ways that we can take the stuff that is left over, unused stuff, and use that instead of cluttering our garage with it, instead of, choking, every closet in our house to the point that you fear opening the door.
Or renting another storage unit.
Or renting another storage unit.
Are like insanely,
they're
on every street corner.
They're everywhere. Yeah. So, to get to the place where we start to realize, this stuff can be used and it can be used by others. That's an application of gleaning. Another application of gleaning is the creation of internship programs where we take young people and we put them to work doing small tasks at the software business or at the mechanic shop. They're just kind of hanging around. They're seeing stuff happening. This is does it cost you a ton of money? They're literally just on the edge of the field picking up pieces of grain, but it's an opportunity for us to begin to use the extras of what we've got to minister to those who can really use it. I love seeing some of these HGTV shows taking other people's junk and turning it into really, really cool stuff. On the internet, from Pinterest to Etsy and everything else, you see all of these people doing these little entrepreneurial things with the junk of the world. I've got a Kurdistan map that somebody made for me out of a broken piece of barnwood hanging in my office. That's a kind of gleaning. That's not the same thing as Ruth getting food for Naomi, but it's the principle of taking the extras, the stuff at the edge of the field, what normally would be wasted, and finding ways to use it.
And I think the striking thing about the gleaning laws, too, is that it would allow the landowner to identify good workers.
Oh, yes.
And so
yeah.
it's
and that's the great thing about internships.
Exactly.
Internships, you go, wow, that kid works.
Yeah.
Just for those of you who are local here, the Hope Center is an example of that. We've got Goodwill. We've also got the Hope Center, which is an explicitly Christian thing, and they take donations and they fix things up. But they also use it as a place to train people who on how to run a store, how to sell things and whatnot,
and how to work, really.
Yeah,
how to show up for work on time, and they rehabilitate people who haven't ever held down a job. So, any further suggestions as to reading resources or places to get started with this?
I think I mentioned in my talk "Life at the Bottom" by Theodore Dalrymple.
Dalrymple is such a delightful writer. Doesn't matter what subject he's writing about, whether it's prison reform or hospitals. He's just a great writer.
A couple of books by him. Life at the Bottom by him he was a doctor in an inner city London hospital, and he describes a lot of the pathologies that were going on there. That's Life at the Bottom. He also has a small book called Romancing Opiates, which is provocative title, and he talks about drug addiction there and how we've romanticized drug addiction. So the tormented, misunderstood artist, is considered a hero because he got off of heroin, and so he traces the history of this idea. It's a weird idea. It's a great book. Another book of his, Our Culture, What's Left of It. He's not a Christian writer, but I think he's in very close danger of becoming a Christian. He's that kind of guy.
He has a weekly column on the Techie Mag website, TAKI, writer for the London Spectator. I really, really like some of the work of Marvin Olaski. Marvin Olaski can sometimes lean in a little more of a statist direction than I would, but he was the inspiration behind George H.W. Bush's 1,000 Points of Light, and he has written The Tragedy of American Compassion. He's written a number of books about the way that state intrusion inhibits Christian action. And he's the editor of World Magazine. He has a podcast on compassionate ministries, inner city ministries, tutorial ministries all around the U.S. And I find his stuff often really, really provocative and helpful.
Thomas Sowell, Vision of the Anointed, is a wonderful book. The subtitle says it all: self-congratulation as a basis for public policy, I think it goes. So
anything by Walter Williams is really helpful. To understand Hayek, I find Murray Rothbard really, really helpful. His Man-State Economy book is this gargantuan doorstop, but it is incredibly enlightening and sort of throws the light on the difference between the Austrian School of Economics and Keynesianism, which is the driving principle behind U.S. economic policies?
It's helpful. I think the striking thing in several of the talks and even in these answers is we see the church at odds with the state in this battle for caring for the poor, and that the state has inserted itself where it has no business belonging. And I think the encouragement from your talks and from the word is that we know who's going to win that battle. We know who's going to triumph in the end. And so it's incumbent upon us as the church to not grow weary in doing good, and not throwing in the towel and saying the government's just too big and too strong now for us to even compete with it, but to be creative with those ways of knowing that the bureaucracy becomes so overgrown that it's going to collapse upon itself. And so with that, why don't we give them a hand and thank them for their time?
Thank you.